Imagine a beast that refuses to die. You pour hundreds of shells into it. You tear it with torpedoes. It is engulfed in flames. Yet it keeps moving forward. This is not a scene from a disaster movie. This is the real story of the Bismarck, a 50,000-ton monster that challenged an entire ocean single-handedly. To stop this steel titan, a single squadron was not enough. The British Navy had to do the unthinkable. They mobilized a literal armada. Battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, destroyers. Dozens of warships abandoned their missions and surged into a hunt for one single target. Adolf Hitler called this ship a masterpiece of engineering, but even he could not have imagined the bloody drama its first and only voyage would become. Why did the most modern floating fortress of its time turn into a death trap for 2,000 men? How did fragile planes from the previous century manage to bring a technological marvel to its knees? And why did this ship refuse to sink, even when it seemed impossible? Today, we reconstruct the full timeline of the largest hunt in naval history. But to understand the scale of this tragedy, we need to go back to where this monster was born, in violation of every international law and treaty. After the defeat in World War I, Germany was placed on a short leash. The Treaty of Versailles was designed so that this country could never threaten the seas again. They were allowed only a tiny fleet, old coastal defense ships. The maximum displacement for a new warship was capped at 10,000 tons. For comparison, that is the weight of a modern cruise ship, not a machine of death. But in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler came to power, and the rules of the game changed instantly. First secretly, then openly, Germany began rebuilding its military might. Engineers in Hamburg were given a top-secret task: build a ship that could single-handedly flip the balance of power in the Atlantic. And they created a project that spat in the face of all international limits. Officially, Berlin claimed the new battleship would be 35,000 tons. The world powers, including Britain, chose to turn a blind eye, hoping Hitler's ambitions would stop there. What a fatal mistake that was. When the Bismarck's keel first touched the water at the Bloemenvoss shipyard, the reality was terrifying. It was not 35,000 tons. Fully loaded for war, this steel monster weighed over 50,000 tons. The whole length was 251 meters. That is 2.5 football fields of pure metal. It was so wide that the ship could barely fit through the locks of the Kiel Canal. This was not just a ship. It was a floating city built for war. Imagine, over 2,000 crew members on board. They had their own bakeries, operating rooms, workshops, even their own breweries. The ship's electrical grid could have powered a small European city. And the armor belt, made of special Voton steel, was so thick it was considered absolutely impenetrable by most guns of that time. February 14, 1939, Hamburg. Tens of thousands gathered for the launch. Adolf Hitler was there in person, watching as the granddaughter of Chancellor Bismarck broke a bottle of champagne against the bow. To him, this battleship was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of rebirth, a steel fist meant to inspire terror. But here is the interesting part. Hitler, despite all his aggressive rhetoric, was actually afraid for this ship. He knew that losing such a symbol would be a propaganda disaster. So, when the Bismarck was finished, it did not go to war immediately. It sat. For months, it hid in the Baltic Sea, conducting endless drills away from British eyes. It seemed this giant would remain a boogeyman that would never leave its safe harbor. However, you cannot hide such a colossus forever. In May 1941, the order was given. And as the Bismarck's propellers churned the water, a chain reaction began that no one could stop. The plan was simple and cruel. Operation Rheinübung. The goal was not to seek a fair fight with the British fleet. Battleships are too expensive for duels. The Bismarck's task was far more sinister. Break out into the Atlantic and systematically destroy merchant convoys. Imagine a wolf entering a sheepfold. It does not need to fight the sheepdogs. Its goal is the defenseless sheep. If this giant reached the shipping lanes, Britain, dependent on supplies from the US, would simply suffocate from hunger. May 18, 1941. The port of Gdynia. Under the cover of night, the Bismarck weighs anchor. Accompanying it is the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, smaller but still deadly. This pair of ships was called the Brothers, but keeping their departure a secret was nearly impossible. How do you hide an elephant in a china shop? You don't. Just 2 days later, as a squadron passed the Kattegat Strait between Denmark and Sweden, they were spotted. The Swedish cruiser Gotland transmitted a message to its headquarters. The information immediately leaked to the British naval attaché. In London, the red light started flashing. The hunt began before the first shot was even fired. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the operation, knew he was spotted. He decided to stop in the Norwegian fjords near Bergen. The ships entered a narrow bay surrounded by cliffs. The crew feverishly repainted the black and white camouflage on the sides to a flat gray to blend in with the Atlantic fog. And it is here that a moment occurs that historians still debate today. A moment that likely sealed the battleship's fate before the battle even began. While the Prinz Eugen refueled from a tanker, the Bismarck just sat there. For some reason, Lütjens did not order the flagship to refuel, even though the hoses were ready in time allowed. Was he afraid of an air attack? Or was he too confident in his range? We don't know. But we do know one thing. A few days later, when every liter of fuel would be worth its weight in gold, the crew would curse that stop in Norway. Meanwhile, the British were not sleeping. Risking his life at a dangerously low altitude, a reconnaissance Spitfire roared over the fjord. The pilot took only a few photos, but when they were developed, the Admiralty officers felt their breath catch. On the grainy photo, the silhouette of a giant was clearly visible. There was no doubt. The Bismarck was preparing for its leap. Bombers were immediately scrambled. They were given coordinates and told to bomb blindly through the clouds. But when the bombs hit the water, the explosions only raised plumes of spray. The fjord was empty. The Bismarck was already gone. While British pilots stared at empty water, the German squadron was already dissolving into the North Sea fog, heading for the Denmark Strait. They thought the hardest part was over, but they were sailing straight into a waiting trap. When London realized the Bismarck had vanished, a deathly silence fell over the Admiralty. This was the worst nightmare for any British admiral. If such a leviathan reached the open ocean, finding it would be harder than finding a needle in a haystack. And while it remained hidden, it would sink food and fuel convoys by the dozen. The commander of the British fleet, John Tovey, made a decision worthy of a poker player going all in. He sent everything he had. The trump card was the mighty Hood, a battlecruiser that had been the symbol of British naval power for 20 years. It was an icon, the darling of the nation, the largest ship in the Royal Navy. Joining it was the brand new battleship Prince of Wales. In fact, it was so new that civilian workers were still on board, tightening bolts in the gun turrets while it sailed to war. Their destination was the Denmark Strait, a narrow strip of water between the glaciers of Greenland and the coast of Iceland. This is where the Bismarck was heading. Admiral Lütjens was counting on the weather. In these latitudes, there is almost always a thick fog and snow, reducing visibility to zero. The perfect conditions to slip through unseen. But Lütjens did not know that the technology of war had changed. The fog no longer protected them. On the evening of May 23rd, the British heavy cruiser Suffolk, patrolling the ice edge, noticed something strange. On their radar, a cutting-edge device at the time, a blip appeared. 7 miles. Too large for an iceberg, too fast for a merchant ship. On the bridge of the Suffolk, everyone froze. Out of the fog, tearing through the veil, a black silhouette emerged. It was him. The Bismarck was sailing just a few kilometers away. The British immediately dove back into the mist to avoid destruction and began transmitting coordinates. Enemy detected. Course 240. High speed. This radiogram sliced through the airwaves. The Hood and the Prince of Wales, racing at full speed, now had a target. The trap snapped shut. Two giants were closing in on each other in the icy water at a combined speed of nearly 60 kilometers per hour. The crews did not sleep. The gunners checked the ammunition hoists. Everyone knew. The morning of May 24th would be the last for thousands of men. It was 5:50 a.m. The sun barely rose over the horizon, lighting the cold waves. And at that moment, lookouts on the Bismarck shouted, "Smoke on the horizon!" The distance was closing with terrifying speed. 20 kilometers, 15, 10. At 5:52 a.m., the silence of the icy wasteland was shattered by the first salvo. British Admiral Holland on the bridge of the Hood gave a fatal order. Fire at the lead ship. He was certain the Bismarck was leading, but he was wrong. Due to a radar failure on the German flagship, the ships had swapped places. The cruiser Prinz Eugen was leading. British shells rained down on the smaller ship, wasting precious seconds. But the Germans remained silent. Admiral Lütjens hesitated. He still hoped to avoid the fight and simply slip away. But Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, could not take it anymore. Legend has it he roared into the phone. "I will not let my ship be shot out from under my ass. Open fire!" At 5:55, the Bismarck fired its first salvo. 8 380mm guns threw nearly 7 tons of lethal steel into the sky. The shells flew for almost a minute. First overshot, second undershot. The Germans were zeroing in with terrifying precision. On the Hood, they knew they were in mortal danger. Their ship was fast and heavily armed, but its deck armor was too thin for these ranges. Bismarck's shells were falling almost vertically, punching through decks like paper. 6 a.m., the fifth salvo from the Bismarck. One of the shells finds its mark. It punches through the Hood's thin armor and explodes deep inside, right in the ammunition magazine. What happened next defies description. It was not a normal explosion. Witnesses said that silently, as if in a silent movie, a pillar of fire half a kilometer high rose over the ship. Massive gun turrets, weighing hundreds of tons, were tossed into the air like toys. The steel spine of the Hood snapped in half. Britain's greatest ship, the symbol of the empire, vanished from the ocean's surface in just 180 seconds. Out of 1,418 men, only 3 were pulled from the water. 3. Left alone, the battleship Prince of Wales was trapped. Its guns jammed. The civilian mechanics simply hadn't finished calibrating them. The captain realized continuing the fight was suicide. He laid a smokescreen and began to retreat. It seemed like a total triumph. The German squadron had destroyed the enemy's pride in 5 minutes. The crew celebrated. But no one noticed that this battle was the beginning of the end for the Bismarck itself. During the shootout, one British shell had hit the German giant. It did not look fatal, just a hole in the bow. But from that hole, fuel began to leak into the ocean. In London, the news of the Hood's destruction had the effect of a bomb. It was not just a military defeat. It was a strike to the very heart of national pride. The Admiralty was in a rage. Winston Churchill, upon hearing the tragedy, gave an order that became legendary. It consisted of only 3 words: sink the Bismarck. No conditions. No if possible. This ship had to die, no matter the cost to the Royal Navy. And Britain responded like it never had in history. All current operations were cancelled. Food convoys were left unguarded. From Gibraltar, from Halifax, from Scapa Flow, from everywhere the British had ships, they turned and headed for the intercept. Battleships Rodney and Ramillies, battlecruiser Renown, aircraft carrier Ark Royal, about 40 vessels in total. The map of the Atlantic began to fill with arrows pointing to a single spot. This was no longer an operation to protect convoys. This was an execution. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the German giant, the mood was very different. The euphoria of victory was quickly replaced by grim calculations. That shell from the Prince of Wales, which seemed like a scratch, had actually caused fatal damage. It pierced the fuel tanks in the bow. The Bismarck took on 2,000 tons of water. The ship's bow slumped. The propellers occasionally broke the surface. And most importantly, Access to 1,000 tons of fuel was cut off. Lutyens faced a choice: turn back to Norway or break for the French coast, to Brest or Saint-Nazaire. Norway was closer, but there the ship could easily be reached by British bombers. France was further, but there dry docks and repair waited, with a direct exit back to the Atlantic. Lutyens chose France. It was a logical decision, but as it turned out, a lethal one. To save at least one ship, Lutyens ordered the Prinz-Eugen to break off and go on a solo raid. The Bismarck was left alone. A wounded beast against the entire British pack of hounds. But there was a problem German engineers could not solve. Fuel was leaking into the ocean from the punctured tanks. Behind the Bismarck's stern stretched a wide, oily trail. For the British cruisers following him, it was a red carpet. They didn't even need radar. The smell of fuel and the rainbow film on the water said, "We are here. We are bleeding, but we are still dangerous." Lutyens, realizing he was being followed, made a move of desperation. He turned sharply and opened fire on his pursuers, giving the Prinz-Eugen a chance to escape. It worked. The cruiser got away. But the Bismarck took more hits. And then something happened that is still debated today. Lutyens, certain that British radars saw right through him, decided to break radio silence. He sent a detailed report of the battle to Berlin that lasted nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes on the air. British radio operators couldn't believe their luck. They immediately triangulated the signal. The circle on the map narrowed to a few square miles. Now the British knew exactly where he was. But knowing the coordinates and sinking a steel mountain are two different things. The heavy battleships were still far away. The only ones who could reach the Bismarck right now were plywood biplanes. The situation for the British was becoming critical. Despite all efforts, the math of war was relentless. The Bismarck was getting away. The Royal Navy battleships, no matter how powerful, simply could not physically catch the German giant. A little longer, and the Bismarck would enter the range of support aircraft. As soon as German bombers appeared in the sky, the hunters would instantly become the prey. Churchill demanded results, but Admiral Tovey had only one last chance left. And that chance looked like a joke. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Its deck was tossing on the waves with massive amplitude. Taking off in such weather was suicide. But orders are orders. The pride of the Empire was rolled out onto the runway, the Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. To understand the absurdity, these were biplanes. Fabric, wood, and wire. An open cockpit where the pilot sat in the freezing wind. Top speed with a torpedo? Less than 150 kilometers per hour. Against the ultra-modern Bismarck, with its radars and automatic AA guns, these planes look like museum exhibits from World War I. The Germans laughed at them. British pilots called them string bags. But it was these kites that had to stop the most dangerous beast in the ocean. The first sortie was a disaster that for a long time people preferred to keep quiet about. In the heavy clouds, the squadron found a ship. The pilots, blinded by rain and adrenaline, attacked and dropped their torpedoes. Only when pillars of water rose did they realize with horror it wasn't the Bismarck. They had attacked their own cruiser, the Sheffield, which was trailing the German. Tragedy was avoided only by a miracle. The new magnetic detonators on the torpedoes fired prematurely before hitting the hull. The Sheffield dodged, and the pilots, burning with shame, returned to the carrier. But this mistake saved the operation. The armorers realized that magnetic detonators were useless in a storm. They were quickly replaced with old-fashioned contact detonators, the ones that only fire upon direct impact. The second sortie. Twilight. 15 swordfish rise into the sky again. This time, there is no room for error. Fuel is low. They find the Bismarck by the flashes of its AA guns. The Germans opened a hellish fire. It seemed the air around the battleship turned into a solid wall of lead and flame. But then, an incredible paradox occurred. Bismarck's ultra-modern fire control systems were calibrated for fast fighters. The German computers were calculating lead for targets flying at 400 to 500 kilometers per hour. No engineer imagined they would be attacked by planes that barely outpaced a car. The shells exploded far ahead of the planes, and those that did hit simply punched through the fabric skin of the biplanes without exploding, because the fuses didn't feel enough resistance from the thin cloth. The Swordfish broke through the wall of fire. Pilot John Moffat approached from the stern. He saw the massive bulk of the ship trying to dodge. He pressed the release. The torpedo splashed into the water and streaked toward the target. The first torpedo hit the armor belt. For the Bismarck, it was like a mosquito bite. But the second torpedo struck the most vulnerable spot of any ship, the stern, right into the steering gear. The explosion wasn't the most powerful, but its consequences were fatal. The rudders jammed. The massive mechanism, weighing hundreds of tons, turned into a useless piece of mangled metal. On the bridge of the Bismarck, they felt the hit, but didn't yet realize what happened. Captain Lindemann ordered to straighten the course. The helmsman tried to turn the wheel, but the ship wouldn't obey. It began slowly, but inevitably, to describe a massive circle, turning its bow straight toward its pursuers. At first, no one on the bridge panicked. Battleships are built to survive torpedo hits. The Bismarck had a triple bottom, massive bulkheads, and a counter-flooding system. But when the helmsman reported that the wheel was spinning freely and the ship continued to arc to the left, the officers' faces turned pale. Engineers rushed to the steering compartment, a cramped, suffocating room at the very stern, housing the giant hydraulic rudder drives. What they saw there was a death sentence. The torpedo blast hadn't just jammed the rudders. It bent the shafts themselves and destroyed the mechanisms, locking both rudder blades at 12 degrees to port. 50,000 tons of steel, racing through a storm, were now unsteerable. Captain Lindemann tried the impossible. He ordered the ship to be steered using the propellers, full speed on the starboard screws and stopping the port ones to swing the bow. In calm water, it might have worked, but the Atlantic was merciless. A Force 8 gale began. The wind howled so loud it drowned out commands. Massive waves slammed the hull, and every time the Bismarck tried to lay a course for France, the elements ruthlessly pushed it back. Bow first to the northwest, right toward the British fleet. A desperate attempt was made to send divers into the flooded compartment to manually disconnect the rudders or even blow them off. But the stern was pitching up and down with the amplitude of several stories. The water inside the compartment churned, grinding metal debris. Anyone who stepped in there would have been turned into mincemeat in seconds. Realizing that mechanics were powerless, Admiral Lutyens performed what many historians call the ultimate act of military duty. He did not try to hide the truth from the crew. At midnight, a radiogram went out into the air, intercepted in both London and Berlin. The text was dry and terrifying. Ship unsteerable. We shall fight to the last shell. It was a goodbye. 2,200 men on board realized they were not going home. They were stuck in the middle of the ocean on a ship that could only walk in circles. But death did not come instantly. First came the vultures. British destroyers surrounded the wounded giant to give him not a second of peace. This night became the longest in the lives of every one of the 2,000 sailors on board. In pitch darkness, the British decided not to just wait for morning. 5 small ships lunged at the wounded beast. The destroyers closed in, darting out of rain squalls, launching torpedoes, and vanishing back into the dark. Not one of these torpedoes dealt a fatal blow to the Bismarck, but they achieved the main goal. They exhausted the crew to the limit. Every half hour, the battle alarm sounded. Gunners, who hadn't slept for days, stared into the blackness with bloodshot eyes. Men collapsed from fatigue, but fear wouldn't let them sleep. The most terrifying weapon that night wasn't torpedoes, but light. British ships began launching star shells. They hung in the sky on parachutes, flooding the ocean with a ghastly, pale glow. The Bismarck was laid bare, massive and helpless, while its tormentors remained in the shadows. Inside the ship, the atmosphere shifted from combat to funeral. Discipline began to crack. Some prayed. Some wrote farewell letters, hoping they would one day be found. Admiral Lutyens no longer gave orders for maneuvering. What was the point of maneuvering a ship that only moved in circles? By morning, the wind died down a little. The horizon began to gray. The destroyers retreated, having done their job. Now the executioners were to take the stage. Smoke appeared on the horizon. It was the battleships Rodney and King George V. They were coming to carry out the sentence. At 8:43 a.m., lookouts saw a dark silhouette on the horizon. The Bismarck was moving toward them at a speed of only 7 knots. First to speak was the Rodney. Its massive guns threw tons of steel. A minute later, Admiral Tovey's flagship joined in. It was a methodical, cold execution. The British split up, approaching the German from 2 sides. The Bismarck fought back. Its first salvos were frighteningly accurate. But without the ability to change course, the German gunners were doomed. At 9:02, a direct hit from the Rodney obliterated Bismarck's forward turret. A few minutes later, the second turret fell silent forever. Another heavy shell smashed directly into the conning tower. Admiral Lutyens, Captain Lindemann, and all senior officers likely died instantly. The ship had lost its head. The Rodney approached the Bismarck to an unbelievable distance, less than 3 kilometers. The massive guns were firing at point-blank range. Every shell turned the internal spaces into a glowing hell. Deck armor buckled, bulkheads snapped. The ship turned into a massive, burning island. At one point, a British officer lowered his binoculars and said quietly, "I cannot look at this." But the Bismarck did not sink. Its unique armor scheme protected the vital parts deep underwater, while everything above turned into a mess. At 10:15, Admiral Tovey ordered to cease fire. The British were running low on fuel, and the Bismarck was already a pile of smoking wreckage. But it still stayed afloat. No one threw out a white flag. The British decided to finish it with torpedoes. But at that very moment, deep in the belly of the dying battleship, the remaining mechanics made their final decision. They opened the seacocks. At 10:36 a.m., a final sound echoed over the mangled hull. It was the roar of opening valves. Deep below, men whose names we will never know performed their final duty. They did not intend to surrender their ship to the enemy. The steel mountain began to slowly roll to the port side. 3 minutes later, the Bismarck capsized. The massive main turrets simply fell out of their sockets and plunged into the abyss. At 10:39 a.m., the stern of the battleship finally vanished underwater. A haunting silence fell. Out of 2,200 men, only about 800 were left alive. They floated in the icy water, hoping for a miracle. British ships approached the site and began lowering lines. English sailors were now risking their lives to pull their enemies from the waves. But there is no happy ending to this story. When only 110 people were brought on board, a U-boat sighting was reported on the horizon. The captains of the British ships made a cruel and split-second decision. Fearing an attack, they went to full speed and left, leaving hundreds of men to die in the open ocean. Out of the massive crew, only 116 men survived. Thus ended the story of the Bismarck. Adolf Hitler was furious. The loss of the flagship was a signal that the era of big guns was passing. And he was right. This voyage proved to the world, no matter how thick your shell, you are defenseless against a swarm of small planes. The era of battleships ended the moment an old biplane's torpedo jammed the rudder of the German giant. In 1989, researcher Robert Ballard found the Bismarck. It lies at a depth of nearly 5 kilometers. The ship sits on an even keel, surprisingly intact and still formidable. On its armor, the marks of hundreds of hits are visible, but the hull did not break. Today, the Bismarck is a reminder of how easily engineering genius and human courage can become hostages to ambition. It is a story that in a great war, there are no absolute winners. There is only iron going to the bottom, and people who became victims of their own perceived greatness. The sinking of the Bismarck cleared the way for the Allies in the Atlantic. Now convoys could sail with a little less fear. This brought the end of the war closer and saved millions of lives. But the price of that victory remained forever there, in the eternal darkness and cold of the Atlantic Ocean.